Welcome to Everyone is Talking About God. We're starting a brand new series. Here's part 1 on a theology of camp. We're talking about what is camp and the Met Gala. Let's get into it. Okay, what's up everybody? It's Damon, and once again I'm just by myself in this episode. I actually initially wanted to record this topic with a group of friends, and we actually did record a bunch, but after listening to the recording, it was, the quality was kind of bad. There was some problems with the recording, but it was still passable. I would have posted it, but ultimately the whole recording was mainly just me going on and on. So I thought might as well just put out a good recording, and might as well just keep this between me and you, the listener, because I have a lot actually to say on this topic. And the topic, which this is just part 1 of, by the way, because like I said, I have a lot. The topic is a theology of camp. And when I say camp, I do not mean like camping, like bonfire in the woods with tents, Boy Scout, Girl Scout, whatever. No. Completely different word. Same exact spelling and pronunciation, but different etymology and different, okay? Camp is also the theme of this last Monday's Met Gala. And so some of you may have seen the Met Gala and were super interested in this topic of camp and be like, oh, cool, we're talking about this. Some of you may not know anything about the Met Gala, not care at all about fashion. I personally don't usually care all that much about fashion, except for when it has to do with culture. So, and when it has to do with culture, when it's something that affects culture, is affected by culture, then I definitely care about it. So that's why I have a lot to say on this topic. And for those of you on that side, don't worry, we're going to approach this very carefully. It's not going to be like inside baseball, whatever they say. You'll be able to get it. And for those who already understand camp, don't worry. This won't be boring, because I think I'm going to talk about some stuff concerning camp in a way that not many people are talking about. People have talked about camp in the way I'm going to talk about, which I'm going to be going through the history of the fashion that's called camp, the art history of it all, the cultural history, the politics of it, what else? The theological parallels, the biblical parallels. I have a lot to say, like I said, and people have kind of talked about all these things before, but not necessarily all together in the way I'm going to do, and definitely not after this last Monday Met Gala. I didn't see anyone talking about it. I even posted on Twitter, hey, I've been looking and reading through stuff on camp and researching and seeing all these theological parallels. And is anyone else thinking about this stuff too? No response, not even a like. So I felt I needed to get all my thoughts out here. So the Met Gala was based on an essay called Notes on Camp by Susan Sontag, and the title kind of played on that by it being called Camp Notes on Fashion. And first off, let's kind of get a working understanding as we get into this. Now, camp is a sensibility and an aesthetic. It's not easy to define sensibilities and aesthetics at all. And so, as we go through this, we're going to be going through all kinds of different definitions to understand this. First off, let's start off reading the Wikipedia introduction paragraph on camp that can help us start to get going. It says, camp is an aesthetic style and sensibility that regards something as appealing because of its bad taste and ironic value. Camp aesthetics disrupt many of modernism's notions of what art is and what can be classified as high art by inverting aesthetic attributes such as beauty, value, and taste through an invitation of a different kind of apprehension and consumption. Now, it is very important to talk about that inversion and that bad taste. At the end of Susan Sontag's essay, she says the ultimate camp statement is, it's good because it's awful. Of course, one can't always say that, she says, only under certain conditions, those which I've tried to sketch in these notes. And that's what this essay is, literally notes, or what she calls them jottings. And that's what this whole series will be my jottings on this whole thing, because it is kind of a poetics of this stuff, a theopoetics, not exactly a objective analysis of all this stuff. It'll be a lot of interpretation and a lot of, like I said, poetics. So let's talk about this word camp. It starts in France in the 17th century, and it's a French verb. Really, we believe the etymology is actually really obscure and unclear, but most people believe its origin is in the French verb se camper, which means like to strike an exaggerated pose or to flaunt. And there's this 1671 play where one of the characters tells one of his servants, he says, camp about on one leg. So it's being used as a verb here. Camp about on one leg. Put your hand on your hip. Wear a furious look. Strut about like a drama king. So I think that's a good place to start, because it starts way before it's a fashion, or way before people call clothes camp, or call art camp, or call any sort of media camp. It starts as a sort of attitude. It starts as a sort of posture toward life, toward people, toward events. And I think that's really interesting, because that kind of opens the whole thing wide open. We have to start there before we get into the specifics. We have to start at a place where everyone can kind of relate to this. To camp about. Put your hand on your hip. Wear a furious look. Strut about like a drama king. And think Louis XIV, the French king. If you just Google Louis XIV, Louis XIV, you could, I'm sure, probably the first few pictures is him in that exact pose. Hand on your hip, strutting about on one leg. and it's interesting, because also when we think of Louis XIV, if you know who that is, you also usually think of Versailles, which was this huge palace where he would have these amazing events and ceremonies and rituals and parties in his court. And he is known for being extremely extravagant. And we're going to talk more about that history actually in the next episode. Where really in this first one, I want to talk about kind of my life and my interactions with this idea of camp, because there's a reason why I became extremely fascinated with this. And so Louis XIV, in his extravagant parties and extravagant dress, and the requirement of everyone else that came to wear these extravagant dress, you have to think about that. You have to think about this exaggeration, this extravagance, this flamboyance. And at the time, it really just served as a distraction. But then, as time passed by after that, it no longer belonged to the rich and the powerful like kings. It belonged to the marginalized. It became a tool and a strategy of being seen by the rest of the world. Because the marginalized, so often, the reason they're marginalized is because of how much they feel unseen. And by adopting this campish attitude and fashion and way of approaching themselves and their art, it's like, you have to look at us now. And my first interactions with camp, usually a lot of people's first interactions is through the LGBTQ community or through drag shows, because that's kind of the modern American version of it today. But I didn't grow up around that. I grew up in a conservative Christian environment, so I didn't see much of that. I didn't see or know any drag queens until I was much older. And so my first interaction was through glam rock, actually. And glam rock, I would definitely say, is very, very camp. Think David Bowie, Freddie Mercury, Elton John. And the reason, I think it started just as a kind of obsession and fascination and admiration for the 80s and the fashion and the colors and the extravagance. And then as I started to look at those bands and then look at their influences, I ended up finding these other artists like David Bowie and Queen. And David Bowie became very much my role model when I got into youth ministry. Stay with me. I was in youth ministry a few years ago from, I think 2015 to 2017, I believe. Yeah. Actually, that was vocational youth ministry, 2015 to 2017. Before that, it was volunteer youth ministry. But 2015 is where I got an actual job leading my own youth group at this church, a church I grew up in. And I came in to this job looking at it with realizing like this takes so much responsibility. I honored that role so much. I realized this was such a huge deal that I'm getting this role to lead and teach and be in the lives and counsel teenagers. So as I began this job and thought through this enormous responsibility, I started to think about how can I be a great example and role model to teenagers. Teenagers who are very scared of being alone. Teenagers who are scared of expressing themselves, who aren't sure exactly how to express themselves, or afraid of being judged if they express themselves the quote-unquote wrong way. And people who just desperately want to be accepted. And I thought of David Bowie because he led this huge youth movement, and by expressing his own self radically and even experimentally, he encouraged a whole generation to express themselves too, no matter who they were. I think of David Bowie, I think of Ziggy Stardust with his camp outfits, glitter and glam and absolutely colorful and outrageously extravagant and flamboyant and makeup, and on this stage singing his heart out, singing Rock and Roll Suicide to all these young people, saying at the end of that song, "You are not alone. You are wonderful. Gimme your hands." And that right there was kind of my model. And I knew, like, that's what you gotta do. That's what I have to do. And I knew I wanted to, first off, like David Bowie, experiment with my image. I thought of all the ways that I wanted to kind of look and dress, but was afraid of risking and trying out because I was afraid of being judged. And I said, screw it, I'm going to do it. And so and when I say this, remember, I grew up in a conservative Christian environment, so it might not sound that extra to some of you, but it was in my environment. And so I dyed my hair silver and I started wearing these like weird looking jogger shorts because I thought they looked interesting and cool. Long hem shirts because I thought they were interesting and cool, and boots. And I would go to youth group dressed like this, just experimenting with my look and just trying to express myself however I felt that day. And it's funny because a lot of the teenagers there would make fun of me. They would like playfully roast me and my choices sometimes. But I knew at the same time it set a precedent that they can express themselves in strange ways too. And I kept leaning on that. And even the way I preached, I wanted to kind of express that. Like, I inadvertently winded up like striking these poses, kind of like what we said earlier, to camp about, just to strike an exaggerated pose. And people would like catch me in these poses when I would preach, kind of these wide-legged, flamboyant poses, and they would ask me about it. I think only like one or two youth, but also a couple adult leaders, and they would say, like, it's funny. They would point it out playfully, like, it's funny that you'd end up doing that. And yet I knew I was channeling Freddie Mercury or David Bowie a little bit too when I would do that. It was like I was trying to be outrageous, extravagant, kind of just be fully myself, knowing that I looked a little bit ridiculous, so that others can feel comfortable being ridiculous themselves. And I'm not saying all of this is exactly camp. I'm just saying this is kind of my interaction with this before I even knew what camp was. And then when I found out what camp was, it made me remember this mindset that I had. In fact, even toward the end of my time with that youth ministry, I was constantly thinking of ways to make it more extravagant, I guess. And first off, the sermons I was doing would have... There was this huge whiteboard I had in the back that I would always draw and write stuff on. And I would like be camping about the entire room when preaching. And I was thinking of buying this like carpet 3-stair thing, kind of like those like big cat toy, whatever they're called, that they play on, just to put that on the stage to climb on and sit on and stand on as a part of the sermons, because I always wanted it to be theatrical, I guess. Like, I knew it was a performance, and it wasn't about it being a performance. There was definitely content there. It wasn't just style. But I knew that that was important in setting myself up as a role model that helps youth fully be themselves and feel okay expressing themselves. And it actually worked, funny enough. And even like as I was going in this job, I wanted to, and the 3-stair thing I didn't get to try out, and the other thing I wanted to try out eventually, but actually I knew I was never going to do, was even experiment a bit with androgynous clothing, inspired by people like Young Thug, Lil Uzi Vert, Jaden Smith, and who are all like straight cis men who are willing to experiment with their look and realize like clothes are clothes and we can wear whatever we want. But I knew I could never do that in a conservative Christian environment at all. But yeah, I never told anybody that. So those are some of the ideas I had. Also, on my office wall, I had a quote from this old article that some guy wrote about Young Thug and Future, these Atlanta trap artists. And he was talking about how different their music is and how a lot of older people don't really like it, but the young people love it. And there's a quote there. I don't remember the exact quote now, and I think the article might have got deleted. I tried to find it. I couldn't find it. But there's a quote that said, toward the end, the guy wrote, "Young Thug and Future, what makes them so unique and great is that they bend recognizable material into unrecognizable shapes." And that was hugely inspiring for me, and the way I approached ministry and the way I approached preaching and the content of the sermons as well, that in order to reach the next generation, it requires bending recognizable material into unrecognizable shapes. And then I think the quote after that in the same article was about how usually that's how you can tell what the next generation's pop actually is. If it's completely unrecognizable by the previous generation. And yeah, I had other quotes on there, like a quote from Seth Godin's book, Purple Cow, saying you can't out Amazon. I had a little post-it note on my computer that said, pray for everything. Oh, it was, I made it up just because I thought it was fun. Pray for absolutely everything until you find yourself praying for Mars. And all this stuff was around me because I felt like I needed constant inspiration to innovate. Now I think back to all this, and I'm explaining all this because I think back and remember the mindset I was in And I know no other youth minister was thinking like this. Nobody was thinking like this. And yet I feel like they all should be. They all should be thinking about how they present themselves, how they can reclaim certain aesthetics and fashion and art and extravagance in a way that empowers the marginalized, empowers the people who desperately need to feel empowered and inspired to express themselves. That was such an important part of youth ministry for me when I was in that. And so that was the mindset I was in. And then a couple of years later, I hear about camp and then look it up and read Susan Sontag's essay Notes on Camp. And suddenly I was so inspired once again. I realized, oh, that's what I was doing. At least I was inspired by that. Oh, that's what I was inspired by. Except I had no language for it whatsoever. The best language I had at the time was I was just trying to be like David Bowie. You see, how you present yourself and how you make certain ideas presentable, the aesthetics of it all, has always been an integral part of religion. And yet I think so many people having conversations on religion today have completely forgot about the aesthetics of it all, have made it all about information and data and doctrine and theological arguments, and they've missed the whole point. So in this series, I'm wanting to reclaim a lot of this stuff for the conversation of religion, and I think it's extremely important. And before we wrap up this first episode, let's talk about the Met Gala, because the next episode we're going to be talking about like the origins and the history, get really into it. But let's talk about the Met Gala real quick, because plenty of the articles you might have seen, the headlines and the content of it is saying, did they actually get the theme right? Articles saying, why do celebrities show up to these things and not actually dress to the theme? Plenty of articles saying, was it actually camp? Or others just straight up saying, none of them was actually camp. And I think it's interesting. Part of the reason they said that some of it wasn't camp was just because it seemed like some people just came and just dressed nice. When it's like, camp is supposed to be this style that is purposely outrageous and extravagant, and you came in just a nice dress or a nice suit. What? Others, of course, went all out. I'm thinking of Ezra Miller, probably, I think, was my favorite, who had makeup all over his face of eyes. He had his own eyes, and then above on his forehead, look up Ezra Miller Met Gala, you'll see 3 eyes on his forehead, 2 eyes below his eyes, and they looked so good that it looked like he had multiple eyes. It was frightening a little bit, but pretty camp, I would say. But here's also why I think people struggle with this subject when it's meshed with high fashion. Because every single one of those celebrities came dressed in extremely expensive and lavish clothing that the marginalized you're not going to see them in it. Either they can't afford it or they're not bougie like that. And that, I think, reveals this kind of contradiction that is very confusing and a little bit irritating. Because camp does not belong to the rich and powerful. Camp belongs to people who reclaim these extravagant and outrageous pieces of clothing and art, maybe even reclaiming old recycled pop aesthetics in order to allow themselves to be seen by a world that refuses to see them. And when we just see these rich, famous celebrities who the world is always looking at trying to rock this aesthetic, it's like, what? It's like, first off, camp doesn't belong to the rich and powerful. And second off, it's obvious why these people had a hard time figuring out what a camp look is. Because they're not living a life where they're trying to be seen in a world that refuses to see them. And it's funny because I think religion actually has somewhat of a similar problem. The origins of every religion was not to make the rich and powerful happy or make them more rich and powerful, but always to speak to the marginalized, to speak to the lower classes, to the oppressed, to the slaves, to people who actually need empowering. Religion, in the same way, is something that empowers people through ritual and art and a way of posturing yourself in the world. And when it is co-opted by the rich and powerful, it suddenly gets weird. It becomes contradictory, paradoxical, confusing, and irritating. But when it belongs to the poor and the marginalized, it's like, oh yeah, even atheists and religion haters become like, oh yeah, religion can be a good thing. Now I remember. I think camp's the same way. When we look back and realize, oh, when it's actually used by the marginalized in order to empower communities that desperately need empowering, it's like, oh, now I get why this aesthetic is so powerful. Instead of just watching this Met Gala of the extremely rich celebrities dressing extravagantly and outrageously and being like, what is this? More celebrities just being ridiculous? Which I think is why there's been so much confusion in responses in social media and then actual journalistic articles. And so I want to end this first episode with something from another essay, kind of a little bit of a manifesto, called Notes on Camp/Anti-Camp by the writer Bruce LaBruce. And this is from 2012, actually. And the original essay, Notes on Camp by Susan Sontag, provides some examples, but they're pretty dated because it's from 1964. And this essay, Notes on Camp/Anti-Camp, begins with a long list of examples of several different types of camp. And so I wanted to end by just reading this really long list of all these examples to try to get your imagination going and kind of picture this stuff, because you're listening to an audio podcast and we're talking about something that you see. So I understand the difficulty here, believe me. So he starts off with this list. A few lists. The first list is classic gay camp. And believe me, I'll read the list right now. Believe me, we're going to talk about how camp has been defined by the LGBTQ community too. We're doing that in the next one. Like I said, we're going to go through the whole history in the next one. Don't worry. Okay, so classic gay camp. His list includes Carmen Miranda, Mae West, Joanne Crawford, Bette Davis, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Art Nouveau, Art Deco, the Catholic Church, George Kuchar, Franklin Pangborn, Edward Everett Horton, Paul Lind, Charles Nesson Riley, The Boys in the Band, The Killing of Sister George, John Waters Movies, Divine, Mario Montez, Holly Woodlawn, Candy Darling, Jackie Curtis, Liberace. Now here's another list. Bad gay camp, Will and Grace, Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, misogynist drag queens, Neil Patrick Harris, contemporary Broadway musicals, certain Ken Russell films like The Boyfriend, Perez Hilton, Adam Lambert, Liberace, again, Beyonce, Lady Gaga. Good straight camp is another list. Woody Allen's dramatic films, certain Robert Altman films like The Cold Day in the Park, Images Through a Woman, certain John Cassavetes films like The Killing of a Chinese Bookie and Minnie and Moskowitz. Now here's another list. Bad straight camp. Stanley Tucci in The Devil Wears Prada and The Hunger Games, Twilight, Black Swan, Il Divo, Star Wars, Adam Sandler movies, Che Guevara, Damien Hirst, Tim Burton movies, except Pee-wee's Big Adventure and Ed Wood, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jeff Koons, Tropic Thunder, Benny Hill, Beyonce, Lady Gaga, Baz Luhrmann, Now, here's another list. High camp, just 2 on this list. Oscar Wilde, which we're definitely going to talk about in the next episode, a whole bunch. Oscar Wilde and Jean Cocteau. Now, here's another list. Low camp, vaudeville, burlesque, body humor, Moms Mabley, Sophie Tucker, Bette Midler's bathhouse routines. And another list. We're almost done. Ultra camp, Mae West performing Love Will Keep Us Together and Sextet, Elizabeth Taylor and Noel Coward and Boom, Myra Breckenridge, Valley of the Dolls. Another list. Bad ultra camp, Liza Minnelli performing Put a Ring on It and Sex and the City 2. Another list. Quasi camp, Jerry Lewis's 60s movies, The Ladies' Man, The Patsy, The Big Mouth, Midnight Cowboy, Looking for Mr. Goodbar, Luna, Cruising. Another list. Subversive camp, Rock Hudson / Dorsey Day movies, Roddy McDowell's Tam Lin, Brett Anderson of Suede, Pee Wee Herman. Another list. Reactionary camp, Tyler Perry, Eddie Murphy, Heavy Metal. Another list. Liberal camp, Dr. Ruth, Reverend Al Sharpton, Shepard Fairey's Obama Hope poster. Another list. Conservative camp, Kirk Cameron, Sarah Palin, Newt Gingrich, Mitt Romney, Ann Coulter, Fox News, The Iron Lady, and today, I'm adding this, by the way, I know people would add to that list Donald Trump. Another list. Intentional camp, The Shining, Casino Royale with Daniel Craig, Green Acres, the TV show. Another list, second to last list. Unintentional camp, Lost in Space, the TV show, Eyes Wide Shut, J. Edgar, Value of the Dolls, The Iron Lady. And last list, good, intentional, straight camp, Russ Meyer movies, Carry On movies. Okay. Now, the reason I wanted to go through that whole long list is because I'm sure there's some stuff in there that not everybody knows, but there's so much in there that I'm sure everybody got some of it. There's just a bunch of images to put in your head. That was the main reason for reading that long list. Put all these images in your head to get us started. Okay, so that was my little intro on a theology of camp. We're going to go way deeper. I wanted to separate these into multiple episodes because I have so many thoughts in it. I didn't want it to feel overwhelming and you only listen to a little bit and then just stop. So I wanted to separate it into these different topics within a theology on camp. In the next episode, we're talking about the history from Louis XIV to Oscar Wilde and dandies. Yes, like Yankee Doodle Dandy, a dandy. And then to drag queens. So it's going to be dope. Keep listening. I'll see you in the next episode. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter at GodTalkPod. On my personal Instagram and Twitter at WhoIsDamon. And yeah, message me, hit me up. Let me know if you're listening to this series. Let me know what you think about it. And I'll see you guys in the next episode. All right, bye-bye.